Welcome to The Explainer. I want you to picture this. It's February 1959. You're deep in the northern Ural Mountains of the Soviet Union. The landscape is incredibly desolate, the winds are absolutely howling, and the isolation out there is just total. This is Kolatsiakol, a peak whose name literally translates to Dead Mountain in the local indigenous language. And it's right here that one of the most chilling, enduring mysteries of the 20th century unfolded. 9 highly experienced ski hikers went up this freezing slope and, well, not a single one of them came down alive. What they left behind wasn't just a tragedy, it was this massive puzzle that has completely baffled investigators, scientists, and everyone else for over 6 decades.
Okay, let's dive right into this. Fast forward to February 26th. A volunteer search party finally tracks down the group's camp. Now, student searcher Mikhail Sharavan arrives, and he notes just the sheer confusion of the scene. The tent was half torn down, covered in snow, completely empty, and literally all the group's belongings and shoes were left behind. Investigators pretty quickly figured out that this heavy canvas hadn't just been blown open by the wind. No, it had been slashed open from the inside with a knife. And leading away from that shelter, down into this pitch-black, freezing valley, were 9 sets of footprints left by people wearing only socks, maybe a single shoe, or who were just completely barefoot.
So, you might be wondering, what does this all mean? The absolute most crucial question here is why? What could possibly compel 9 rational, highly trained survivalists to essentially destroy their only source of shelter and willingly walk out into a deadly winter storm without their boots or coats? To really wrap our heads around the magnitude of this mystery, we first need to understand exactly who these people were. Because let me tell you, they were definitely not amateurs making a rookie mistake.
Section 1. The Final Expedition.
So this group was led by Igor Dyatlov, a 23-year-old radio engineering student at the Ural Polytechnical Institute, and he handpicked a team of his most experienced peers. Originally, 8 men and 2 women set out. The one guy actually turned back early because of joint pain. Every single remaining member was a highly experienced Grade 2 hiker. They were tackling this specific 300-kilometer trek through the upper streams of the Lazva River for a reason, to earn their Grade 3 certification. And at the time, that was the absolute highest mountaineering qualification available in the Soviet Union. Yet, their final moments completely fly in the face of all that deep expertise. For some reason, they inexplicably cut their way out of a perfectly good standing tent and fled into a deadly storm in what looks like a blind panic.
And to make matters worse, the conditions they were fleeing into were honestly apocalyptic. The temperature on the mountain that night plummeted to negative 40 degrees Celsius, which, by the way, is exactly where the Fahrenheit and Celsius scales meet, so it's negative 40 Fahrenheit too. With heavy snowfall and these fierce, roaring winds whipping across the exposed slope, stepping out into those elements without proper gear was a guaranteed death sentence. Whatever terrified them inside that tent, they clearly thought it was way more dangerous than the freezing reality waiting outside.
Section 2. Timeline of Terror.
By looking at the physical evidence left behind in the snow, investigators were able to piece together a really desperate timeline of that night. First up, you have the sudden, panicked evacuation from the slashed tent. Second, the group actually stayed together. They carefully walked, they didn't run, mind you, they walked a full 1.5 kilometers down the slope to the edge of the forest to find some shelter from the wind. Third, once they got under this large Siberian pine tree, they managed to get a small campfire going. And we know this for sure because branches were broken off that tree up to 5 meters high. That tells us someone was desperately climbing up there, probably to look back up the slope towards the camp. Finally, as the fire died out and that brutal cold really set in, the group splintered. 3 hikers, including Dyatlov himself, actually tried to crawl back up the mountain toward the tent, likely to grab life-saving gear. Tragically, they all collapsed and died in the snow, spaced hundreds of meters apart.
Now, medical science can actually explain one of the most chilling details of this whole scene. The first 2 bodies the searchers found were right next to the remains of that campfire, but they were shoeless and stripped down to basically just their underwear. Now, I know it looks like total madness, but it's a very real, documented phenomenon known as paradoxical undressing. Basically, in the final lethal stages of hypothermia, your brain's temperature regulation completely shorts out. The victims feel this sudden, burning sensation of extreme heat. So, totally confused and actively dying, they literally strip off their clothes to cool down.
Section 3. The Investigation. At first, authorities assumed they were just dealing with a tragic, but, relatively straightforward case of accidental freezing. The first 2 groups undeniably died of hypothermia, but it actually took over 2 months for the snow to thaw enough to reveal the final 4 hikers.
They were found in a forest ravine about 75 meters deeper into the woods, and this discovery, it completely shattered the whole hypothermia narrative. These four were actually wearing extra layers. They'd even wrapped their feet in torn garments they'd stripped from their dead friends. But the most shocking detail by far, they didn't freeze to death. They were killed by massive physical trauma.
And this brings us to the absolute most baffling part of the entire investigation: the autopsy anomalies. One hiker had severe, fatal skull damage. Two others suffered these massive, crushing chest fractures. The lead medical examiner, Boris Verserdeni, went on record saying the force required to cause these specific injuries was equal to a severe car crash. But here's the impossible part. There were no external wounds, no bruises, no cuts matching the broken bones whatsoever. It was honestly as if they'd been crushed by this immense, invisible pressure. On top of that, some bodies found in the running creek water were missing soft tissue, like eyes and a tongue. Though to be fair, this is widely attributed to natural decomposition and aquatic scavengers. Ultimately, the Soviet investigators just closed the case, vaguely blaming an unknown compelling natural force.
Section 4. Compelling natural forces.
So what on earth was this compelling natural force? Well, over the decades, researchers have obsessively pored over the declassified files, trying to find a logical explanation. Let's start with the most scientifically supported one. Fast forward to 2020, and the Ural Federal District officially concluded that an avalanche was the cause of death. But wait, we're not talking about a massive Hollywood-style avalanche here. Remember, the hikers dug a cut into the snow so they could pitch their tent on a flat surface. Throughout the night, fierce katabatic winds dumped heavy layers of snow right above them. Eventually, a small, dense slab of hard snow silently released and just crashed down onto the tent. This totally explains why they slashed their way out in a panic. They thought they were going to be buried alive. And it also explains why everything they did next, fleeing to the trees, starting a fire, digging a snow cave, were actually textbook emergency survival protocols. Ironically, it was their deep expertise that dictated they had to abandon that tent. These severe internal injuries on those final four hikers, those likely happened when the snow cave they dug in the ravine collapsed under 4 meters of heavy snow.
But what if it wasn't snow that drove them out into the dark? What if it was sound? There's this fascinating meteorological phenomenon called a Kármán vortex street. When you have hurricane-force winds hitting the specific dome-like topography of a mountain, like Kholat Shako, it can actually create a series of mini tornadoes. These swirling vortices generate what's called infrasound. These are super low-frequency sound waves that we can't consciously hear, but our bodies can absolutely feel them. And infrasound is scientifically proven to induce inexplicable feelings of terror, panic, and severe shortness of breath. So this theory suggests the hikers woke up in pitch darkness, completely overwhelmed by this roaring noise and a severe physiological panic attack that they just couldn't control, driving them to slash the tent to escape an invisible threat.
Then there's another deeply researched theory, and this one looks at the Soviet military. Back in 1959, the military was known to test parachute mines in isolated regions. Now, these weapons are designed to detonate in the air, creating a massive concussive shockwave rather than leaving a fiery crater in the ground. If a mine detonated near the pass, that concussive air blast could have easily flattened their tent. And it actually perfectly accounts for those really bizarre autopsy findings. A concussive shockwave can cause massive internal bone fractures without leaving a single external scratch on your skin. Thinking they were under literal bombardment, the group fled to the trees to wait out the blasts, but they eventually succumbed to the brutal cold before they could ever make it back.
Now, before we wrap up, we absolutely have to address a theory that was heavily investigated early on. The idea that local indigenous people, specifically the Mansi or Khanty tribes, murdered the hikers for trespassing. We can firmly, 100% debunk this. Both cultural and geographical evidence proves that Kholat Shako is completely barren. It wasn't some lush hunting ground, which means it wasn't a sacred site that native tribes would fiercely defend. In fact, local folklore considered the mountain to be inhabited by bad spirits, precisely because it was so devoid of life. The indigenous people literally had zero motive to be up on that freezing peak in the middle of a brutal winter storm.
Which brings us to the end of our explainer and leaves us with this final, lingering question. 9 brilliant young lives were snuffed out in a single, terrifying night. Was it just the cruel physics of a slab avalanche punishing one fatal mistake? Was it the madness-inducing hum of infrasound? Or were they just simply in the wrong place at the exact wrong time during a classified military test? I think beyond the morbid fascination, this mystery really endures because it pushes right up against the absolute extreme limits of human endurance. It teaches us just how fragile we truly are against the raw power of nature and how modern science is continually working to illuminate the darkest corners of history. So, what do you think really happened on Dead Mountain? Thanks for joining me on this explainer, and stay curious.